Oh, you
Oh,
can record to you. Okay, there
I
you
am
go.
so I am so happy. Thank you for hanging out with me. You know, I work in a library and you'd think that I would have it down technologically, but I'm a Luddite at heart. And you know, I love it on the page, but I also love it in real life. So I'm going to give you part of my real life. And what Mike said about parents, well, you'll find out a little about parents in here. It wasn't as lovely as he laid it out. But first, you have to try to figure out what this New York Jewish girl is doing in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is the anthracite capital of the United States, except now it's mostly slag heaps. This was a very, very long time ago in the late 50s. Well, what I was doing there was that I had had a terrible summer. I had flunked out of high school because I didn't finish my papers. You may wonder why I didn't finish my papers. It was because they said I was smart, but I felt like an imposter. And so if I didn't finish my papers, they could never figure out whether I was smart or not. And so this left me with this yawning summer in my parents' Central Park West apartment, which I called the scene of the crime because I was pretty miserable there and I was very dramatic. And so I made a suicide attempt with a bottle of aspirin. And as you can see, I'm still here, Hugh. But what were my parents, my suffering but toxic parents, going to do with me? Well, they called Uncle Irv, the doctor who lives in Ellenville, New York. And they said, well, she did this, and what are we supposed to do now? And he said, you know, I heard of a place in Wilkes-Barre called the Children's Service Center. And if you send her there, they'll shape her up. So they sent me there. And guess what? It shaped me up. Here was the deal. Most of the other the patients, whatever you call them, were acting out young boys. And I was closer to the age of the counselor. So I felt like a counselor. So I started to act like a counselor and I released a lot of this toxicity. You could say all I needed to do was get away from them. And so when I actually graduated from Wilkes High School, and they were interested in me there because I was exotic. I was from New York. And I did finish my papers there because I didn't care whether anybody knew whether I was smart or not. I decided to go to Wilkes College because it had worked so well. And so there I was in this attic room with my roommate Sylvia Gutfleisch, who I have a feeling was the only other Jew on campus. And Sylvia had an unofficial major, which was her fiance. She would flash her ring. She would call her fiance. She would sigh over her fiance every night in this little attic room. And I had a couple of unofficial majors. One of them was to sing and to dance. I loved it. You didn't have to do papers, you just had to show up and emote. The other one was called Russ Miller. He was a professor of mathematics, and I have nothing to do with mathematics. I'm numerically challenged, you could say. But we got to know each other on the Greyhound bus going back and forth from Wilkes-Barre to New York City, where he also lived. And we kind of, you could say, fell in with each other. I was I was gobsmacked. I was crushed. I crushed like an adolescent. I mean, I was an adolescent. I was only probably 18. Now, what was it about Russ that was so devastating? Uh, he, well, how he looked, he had a low forehead. I think he was Polish despite his last name. He had very intense, bright eyes. He had a shock of auburn hair across that low forehead. He had a nose that tilted up, which was pretty exotic for me, but it was the mouth. Oh, his lips were so full and so soft, and they were always curled into a very sardonic smile. And that kind of suited my sardonic worldview as a rebellious teenager. And so we kind of got to know each other, going back and forth and back and forth. And a certain amount of heat developed between us. But he was a teacher and I was a student, and nothing could happen. I have to tell you how young I was, that at night I would walk to to his house. I mean, a small campus, everybody knew where everyone lived. And I'd stand under his window. You remember that song, Silhouettes on the Shade? I would watch his silhouette. He had a kind of a boxer's body. And then when the light clicked out, I would go back to my attic room with Sylvia Gutfleisch, and she would sigh over her fiance, and I would sigh over Russ Miller. And so it went, so it went, so it went, until I was kicked out of college. Why was I kicked out of college? Because I was found in a full frontal embrace in the dorm room, and you don't do this back then. What had happened is, I was obviously, let's put it delicately, I was very horny. And I was in a production, I think it was Paint Your Wagon. And, I can even remember my part and my one line. I was the French madame. And I said, girls, use your heads for a change. I did not use my head for a change. I was there, kicked out of college. And there I was back at the scene of the crime, my parents' apartment. And then what was I going to do now? I guess I got to get a job. And, I had upper middle class, no experience, no babysitting, no food service. I could type. They sent me to speed writing school. And so they called in, my parents called in a favor from my old nanny, Amelie Sullivan. She was German, but she had married the Irish postman. She had risen in the world, and now she was working at Columbia University Registrar's Office. So I got to be a clerk there. And you'll find out more about that in my next story. But you should know that Russ supposedly had some connection with Columbia. I actually tried to look him up in the files, but I didn't see him there. However, in the halls of Columbia University, there he was right in front of me. This never happens in real life. And so he just looked at me and he tilted his head and he smiled that sardonic smile and he said, "You want to get a drink?" And I said, "Yes." And so we went to the West End Bar and Grill, which was around the corner, which we all went to. That was the hangout. And in this booth with high backs, we kind of checked in with each other. And then he said, "You wanna?" And we were no longer student and teacher. And I said, "Yes." He took me to the Hotel Dixie on 42nd Street. And back then, it was very, very seamy, except for the New York Public Library, the main library. But the Hotel Dixie had rooms to rent for the hour. He was obviously a man of the world. And so our room had 3 double beds, each covered with a grimy metallic spread. We did not take off those spreads. On each of those beds, Russ showed me, led me through sexual amazement. I mean, some of it was very delightful, and some of it was very interesting, and some of it was kind of strange, but it was the gamut. And you should know that I was a sexually adventuresome teenager, but I was an actual virgin. He was a little shocked by this. However, there we were having this experience, this thing I had wanted for so long, and there it was, right in the Hotel Dixie. And after 2 hours, we had pretty much exhausted each other. And he put me in a taxi and sent me back to my parents' apartment, the scene of the crime. And I thought that was it. I mean, I knew he had a girlfriend and they had a pet monkey, enough was enough. And that it was over. But what an experience. It wasn't over. Well, first of all, what he had unleashed in me was very surprising. I mean, there I was on the subway. I was in a state of high orgasmic excitement. I was unleashed, you could say. This went on for a couple of weeks until it died down. And then, it always shows up in literature, it shows up in life. I didn't get my period, and I knew what this meant. But of course, I was deep in denial for a while. And what was I going to do? I wished it away. It didn't happen because I was so dramatic. I prowled along alleyways of New York City in winter, singing sad folk songs and madrigals. I'm sick to my heart and I fain would lie down. And nothing changed. And so what did my parents do? They called Uncle Irv. She's pregnant. What do we do with her now? Well, he said, take her to Cuba. It's legal there. So that's how we ended up in Havana around Christmas time of, I guess it was 58. And so we were met by a guy with a skinny mustache, and he put my parents in a kind of second-rate hotel, and he whisked me to the clinic. And it was actually kind of a lovely place, small, clean, and they were very kind to me. They were tender. I was so young. And then, that's where I had my first cafe con leche. There was this dark aromatic liquid, and there was this light frothy liquid, and they joined in a helix. And oh, I'd never tasted anything so delicious. And the procedure itself was okay. And then he dropped me off to reconnect with my parents, and we immediately went to the Havana Hilton, which was more their style. And there it was holiday time. And right outside the window, I could hear splashing and cheers in the tropics. But the blinds, the drapes were drawn. And for maybe 24 hours, I wept. And I'm not somebody who weeps easily. And I have no idea what I was weeping about. But then, New Year's Eve, they put me on a plane to go back to my life. They were going to take a little vacation in Havana, which they certainly deserved. And you should know, when that plane landed and I stepped out onto the tarmac, that's as long ago as this was, there was that guy I had been seeing, whom I had met at the registrar's office of Columbia University, who had actually been sitting in the booth behind me and seeing everything that had gone on between me and Russ. And yet he had his arms wide open and we embraced. And that was our first unofficial anniversary. And you'll get to know him in my next story. But now we're going to take a little break into the world of folk tales, um, just to switch the intensity over to another story of obsession and impossible love. So here's Haskell. Haskell is a tailor. Haskell is young. Haskell works very hard. You know how hard it is to be a tailor? You're crouched, leaning over, making tiny little stitches. It's hard on the eyes, it's hard on the back. So when his workday was over, he liked to go up on the roof and stretch his back and stretch his eyes up into the firmament. But it was the moon, who gave him solace and joy and pleasure. I have to admit, he kind of fell in love with the moon. And one day he had worked so hard, so long, that instead of coming down and going to bed, he fell asleep on the roof. And as he slept, he had a dream. And in this dream, the moon said, Haskell, I am so cold. You are a tailor. Can you make me a cloak to keep me warm? And in the dream, he said, yes. And then he woke up and he said, what have I done? But he loved her. I mean, this was impossible, but he loved her. And so he went the next day to his uncle, his apprentice, whom he had apprenticed with. And he said, Uncle, I have promised to make a cloak for the moon, and it seems really difficult. Can you give me some pointers? And the uncle rolled his eyes. He said, yeah, I make a cloak for the moon. You might as well make one for the sun as well. And he said, the sun doesn't need a cloak. The sun is warm, but the moon, she's cold, and I promised her. And he just said, you're hopeless, Haskell. You're a hopeless dreamer. I don't know what to do with you. I mean, you're a good tailor, but. However, one of his clients was there getting a coat hemmed. And the client, who was well-traveled, said, Well, you certainly have an interesting project there, young man. And I can't tell you where you would find the proper kind of material to make a cloak for the moon, but I do know that in China, oh, do they have interesting fabrics? I mean, first of all, what comes out of a worm becomes radiant silk. They even have a fabric I've heard that you can throw on a fire and it doesn't dry up. It doesn't burn up. So Haskell, he shut up his shop. He took out his meager savings. Of course, he took his tailor's kit because you always travel with the tools of your trade. And he went to a port city and he got on a ship to go to China. And he got seasick, but he was determined. And when he arrived in China, he started to ask around. He said, I'm looking for a fabric that will kind of change shape, will be as big or as small as you need it. A fabric that's very light but very warm. I don't know what it is or where I could get it. And everybody looked pretty confused, and I'm sure there were a lot of eye rolls there. But a man, another well-traveled person said, I've heard of something that might just fill the bill, but you can only find it at the roof of the world. And the roof of the world, we know it as Tibet, is very far away. So what did he do? He went and joined a caravan across the stony desert, the hot, relentless, stony desert. And if you think you get sick on a ship, on camelback, you get sick too. And they dropped him off at the foot of a very steep mountain. He was a tailor, he wasn't a mountaineer, but he was determined. And he started to climb and climb and climb and climb. He got up to the roof of the world. What an amazing, magnificent, radiant city with the peaks sparkling all around and the air crystalline. But the people looked miserable. And he said, what's wrong? What's wrong? It's our princess. Is she sick? Did she die? No, no, no. She needs to get married and her dress, the traditional dress. She can't get married without the dress. And the dress is a mess. And she can't get married in the mess of a dress. And no one can fix it. And we are all so sad for our princess and our heritage, etc., etc. He said, well, I'm a tailor. Take me to the palace. Let's see what I can do. And so he said to the queen, I will study this dress, this amazing dress, if it's an amazing dress, and, perhaps I can figure something out. So she was pretty desperate, and she took him up to a tower room, which had one small window. And the guard brought in a box and opened the box, and she held up and hung up this dress. And it was as radiant as the mountains, as the air. It was white, it kind of sparkled, but you should see the hem. All the threads were dangling. It looked like a wild animal had been at it. It was indeed a mess. So he reached out to touch one of the threads, and it dissolved right in his fingers. And she said, yeah, that's the problem. No one can touch it to work on it. And he said, leave me with this dress, and I will see what I can find out. And of course, they locked him in because this was a treasure, even though it was a mess. And he took out his magnifying glass to see if he could figure out how it was made. And he studied it and he studied it. And the day grew on and the day got dark. He wasn't even aware of it. He was so concentrated. And through that high, narrow window came a beam of light through the other side of the magnifying glass. And somehow it glommed itself onto one of those dangling threads. And then he got it. He took that magnifying glass and he tilted it and he wove it back and forth. And as he did, these threads of light joined the dangling threads below the hem. And by the morning, he had woven that dress into fullness and beauty. And then he clipped one of the threads. He dropped it into his handkerchief. He wasn't going to touch it, folded it up and put it in his pocket. And, he wanted to know how this fabric would accommodate anything. So he stuck his arm in one of the skinny sleeves and it fit him perfectly. So he knew he had a fabric made of light. And from this, he knew that he had the, he knew how to do it. And so in the morning, can you imagine how happy the queen was, how happy the princess was? The wedding happened right away. Of course, he stayed for the wedding. And she said, we'd like to reward you. We'll give you riches. You can marry one of our beautiful young women. You could stay here. And he said, that's all very kind of you, but I've made a promise to someone back home and I have to leave. But I took a little piece of thread. Is that okay with you? She, of course it is, of course. And so down the mountain he went. And you know, it's harder to go down. You know, there's more potential for velocity and falls. But he managed. He got to the bottom. He got on a caravan on the camels. But every night, when everyone else was sleeping, there he was with that little piece of thread and the magnifying glass. And when the beam of light went through the glass out the other side, he started to weave back and forth. And soon fabric grew under that magnifying glass. And every morning it just seemed to compress. So no one knew what he was doing. And he did this all the way across the desert. And he did it all the way on that ship, carrying him back to his hometown. And when he got into his shop, the fabric seemed just voluminously magnificent, but so light. And he managed, without touching it, to kind of cut it into a cloak-like shape. But then there was a problem. I mean, how, you know, his uncle had pointed out the problem. One of the problems, you can't measure the moon. Sometimes she's large, sometimes she's small. But also, how was he going to get up there? Uh, a ladder of moonbeams came down, and up, up, up he went. He was very good at climbing by now. And he reached the moon, and there she was. And she said, oh, Haskell, I have been so cold. And somehow the fabric kind of whooshed itself over her shoulders, if you can call the moon having shoulders. And she said, Haskell, now at last I am warm. Do you want to stay here? And he said, oh, yes, I want to stay here. And, you know, he's still up there. You can't see him. He's too tiny. But sometimes you can see that cloak around the moon. You know how happy they both are. You know what obsession and determination and love can do in impossible situations. So that's my story, the cloak, a cloak for the moon, which I got from a book and then played with. And now we are going to go back to, well, I won't call it the scene of the crime. We're going to go back to the registrar's office at Columbia University. Now, I was always a rebel. And the deal was that I was behind a big counter, and the students would come up and they'd say, I need a copy of my transcript. And I'd give them the rap. I said, you know, here's the form, fill out the form, give me the money, and in 3 days you'll get your transcript. And they'd always say, I need the transcript yesterday. And I knew that all I had to do was go to the file, pluck out the file, make the copies, and give it to them. And that's the way I did this job. And I don't know if anyone noticed the breach of protocol, but I think the students were very happy. Now, this meant that I had to make a lot of copies. And remember, burn your bra? That was the time when I burned my bra. Of course, I was a rebel. And I wore these peasant blouses. And so every time I leaned over the Xerox machine to make a copy, whoever was around would get, you could say, an eyeful. And there were these two young men who had gotten to know each other in the army in Lynchburg, Virginia. There was Ed and there was John. And it was Ed. Ed was the one who snagged me first because he was so exotic. He was Southern. He had bedroom eyes and he had that Southern accent. And he was very shy. He didn't have much to say. So after the workday, we three would go to the West End Bar and Grill. And I would sit next to Ed, kind of sopping up the pheromones. But again, he was very quiet. And right across from me in the booth was John. And he looked like a big old healthy farm boy. He was from Illinois. But it turned out that he had a very active, lively brain. He was very funny and very literate. And we had all kinds of things to talk about. So I leaned against Ed, And we had this badinage, John and I, back and forth, back and forth. It was so much fun. And then it got cold feet. I mean, here I am, braless, Jewish, crazy girl. And it turned out he had a fiance back in Lynchburg. So he left and that left John and me like two legs of a three-legged stool. And if we wanted to stay standing up, we'd have to kind of lean against each other. And when we leaned against each other, the pheromones started to pop. And a digression, I should tell you that if you're going to, get to know somebody, it's good to do it before that scrim of limerence confuses you. So I knew that I had gotten this fabulous package, and with, somebody who was very, very sexy to me, and very smart. We were having such a good time. We moved in with each other, which you don't do back then, but we did. And we came in separate entrances at the registrar's office because, we didn't want to tip people off, but people are not fooled by that kind of stuff. I mean, especially old nannies. And so every time I passed her desk, which was many times a day, she would mutter, "When are you going to get married? It's time to get married. You should get married." And so there, John and I were sitting above the Hudson River, way up, on, way over it. And I said to him, "Emily says we should get married. What do you think about that?" And he said, "Well, it never occurred to me, but do you want to get married?" And out of my mouth came a resounding yes. And at that moment, it was kind of as if this thing in my chest, my heart, leapt out and plummeted down, 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 and hit the Hudson River and rose back up and lodged itself back in my chest. And I guess it was that moment of, well, I really love this guy, but there are lots of other men out there. And I mean, I'm pledging my troth, but I said yes. And there we were, ready to roll. And I turned the whole shooting match over to my mother because she had been waiting for this for a long time. I mean, first of all, somebody to tame her wild daughter. And my previous suitors had not been appropriate. They were usually the wrong race. They were very poor. They were artists. They were crazy. He was at least, I mean, he was a Gentile, but he was upper middle class, white guy. So I just said, take it and take it where you will. And she had the machinery. We called her the manager. And so I got the dress, which was off-white, befitting my state, and the shoes dyed to match. And John got a suit. It was the first time I'd ever seen him in a suit. And there we were in my parents' living room across from Central Park West. The whole thing was taupe, the carpet, the drapes, the walls. The curtains were open. We could see Central Park West over there. And in front of us was an ethical culture minister. Now, my parents were first generation, kind of embarrassed Jews. And so my father, whose boss was a very interesting guy, got him into ethical culture. It seemed kind of like the appropriate place to land. And I even remember the name of the officiant, Algernon Black. I have no idea what he was saying, but I know that John and I facing each other, we were trembling. We knew how important this was. And then he threw back the veil. Yeah, I had a veil on. And I kissed him. His lips were very, very full, and there wasn't a trace of sardonic on them. And then we were married. And then we hung out with the kids who we and our friends in my childhood bedroom, the scene of the crime. Now, of course, redecorated, but still I could feel everything oozing from the walls, all the crazy stuff I had done in there. And the grown-ups, those were their parents, my parents and their friends, they all went into the dining room. It didn't have a window, but it was full of very stately Biedermeier furniture, and they stuffed their faces, and we drank. We had a glorious time. And then it was time to go to on our honeymoon, which my mother had arranged at the Fox Hill Inn in Connecticut, in their convertible. And I even put on a going away suit. That's how long ago this was. And we got to the Fox Hill Inn, and it certainly looked romantic. There was a stately lobby and a pianist tinkling and a carved and curved balustrade. And up we went to our room, which had twin beds. But it wasn't a big deal because we had been living together. And so that was our official anniversary. Remember, the last one was New Year's Eve. And this one was, I think, the day before or after Thanksgiving. I think it was the day after Thanksgiving. I should remember that. And thus started 35 years of the best sleepover I could possibly imagine, that didn't have to stop till death did us part, which indeed it did. And if I get called back here, you'll find out about that. Now, one thing that I forgot to tell you in my very first story, if you can scroll your minds back, is, my parents stayed on for their vacation. You know who arrived in Havana that very, I think it was New Year's Eve or possibly the next day? Fidel Castro. And so they were marooned in the Havana Hilton for 4 days. They ran out of toilet paper until they could get a flight back to the States. That's a piece that always entertains me enormously. I hope it entertains you. Now I have a little more time. I actually have a lot more time. And I'm going to tell you a few more folk tales because, as it said in my bio, I believe that folk tales are as real life. At least they are to me. And this is about a girl who wanted to be rich, but she didn't have any prospect. She didn't have a job. She didn't have any particular skills. She was very charming. She was very pretty. And as she was kind of pondering this dilemma, there was a knock at the door. And when she opened the door, you know who was standing there? Yes, she recognized him right away. I mean, under the fedora, there was that, face like a skull, no eyes in there, but a lot of very white teeth. Death was smiling. And he was also wearing a kind of pinstriped suit over what looked like bones. And she said, what are you doing here? I am so young. My life hasn't even started. And he said, just relax, dear lady. He said, my job is very hard and often kind of sad. And I look for diversions. And so I got wind that you want to be rich, and I'm going to show you a trick. And with this trick, you can get rich. Here's the trick. And also you can see me. That's part of this magic. People can't usually see me. When someone is sick, I'll be around. But if I'm standing at the head of the bed, there's no problem. That person will get better. If I'm standing at the foot of the bed, well, then, they come with me. There's no question there. But more times, many more times, I'm at the head of the bed. So this is what I suggest, dear lady. You get some cards printed up, Amazing Healer, and spread them throughout town. And everybody's looking for healing. Everybody's, hurting in some way or another. And so then you can go to whoever's sick. And if you see me at the head of the bed, which you usually will, you can do some healings looking stuff. I suggest maybe you put your lovely soft hand on their forehead, and maybe you'll have an incantation or two to make it look special, and they'll get better and you'll get rewarded. And he said, and this will give me pleasure in my long, hard, tedious, but necessary life, if you can call a life from a person who is death. And whoosh, off you went. So she printed up the cards and she handed them out all over town. And the first call came pretty fast and took her to a really funky part of town. It was a hovel. And in the hovel, there was a young man on a mattress on the floor, and his mother was so unhappy. And she said, I think my son is dying and I don't know what to do. And there was Death standing at the head of the mattress. And so she said, I think I have the way to help him. And she put the soft hand on his forehead. It was sweating to be the man. And she muttered some interesting incantation. And the boy's eyes opened and the color came back into his face. And he took a deep breath. And his mother was overjoyed. She said, we have almost nothing, but she gave the girl a copper coin. It was a sacrifice, but it was the beginning. Because the next night she got called to a very elegant house. I mean, there were carpets on the floors, there were many, many rooms, and in one of the bedrooms was the man's wife. She looked positively green with sickness. And he said, what can you do for my wife? Nobody has done anything for my wife that made her any better. And there was Death standing at the head of the bed. So she did the soft hand, she did the incantation, the woman's color returned, the eyes open. Oh, that man was so happy. He gave her a big sack of silver coins. She was on her way. And this kept happening, and it was good. I mean, once in a while there would be a death, but the groundswell of healing stories just made everybody trust her implicitly. And she got rich. Yes, indeed, she got rich. But she was missing something, and we all know what that something is. Riches don't do it when you don't got love. She wanted love. And then the call came from the palace. So the king's son, the prince, he was very, very sick, and they had tried everything. And here was this healer, and why not try her? And she was very excited. And she came up to the palace. The gates were made of gold and they parted, and the driveway, if that's what you want to call it, the entrance went on forever. And then in the palace itself, there were these long marble corridors, and she was led through them. It seemed to take forever. And there was the prince's bedroom. It was, as big as a house, but she couldn't see the prince because he was in his very special bed. This bed was a four-poster, but the four posts were oak trees, living oak trees in barrels. She noticed there were wheels under the barrels, which was a good idea because, you have to move the bed to clean under it. And there was a thick curtain all around it. And so the king had the curtain pulled aside, and there was Death standing at the foot of the bed. She thought fast. She seized one of those oak trees. She swiveled that bed around. He was standing at the head. She had tricked Death, and there wasn't a thing he could do. And disgustedly, he disappeared. And the prince took a deep breath, and opened his eyes, and the color came back to his face, and he saw this charming healer, and indeed they fell in love. And the wedding happened fast because everybody was ready for this wedding. And there she was on the back of the horse. They were riding tandem. They were going to go on check out the lands, what was waiting for them out there. And all of a sudden, whoosh, she was yanked out of the saddle. Up, 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 up she went, up into the sky, up through the clouds, up past the sun, up past the Milky Way, up into such darkness she had no idea where she was. But somehow in that darkness there was a door, and the door opened, and there was Death in his cave, an enormous cave lit by flickering oil lamps. And he smiled at her, and he said, you tried to trick me. It was pretty clever, but you can't trick Death. He said, you want to know about these oil lamps? These are lives. And the amount of oil in each lamp determines how long the person will live. He picked one up. He said, this is yours. You have about 5 minutes left. And She looked at him and the light went on. She was very clever. She said, well, you got me. What can I do? I had a wonderful run of it. I really enjoyed it. But you don't know that I am a storyteller as well as a healer. And we could make those 5 minutes interesting because I could tell you a story. And he said, that sounds good. I'm always up for a good story. And he settled his bony self into his large armchair, which was stuffed with human hair. And she sat at his feet and she started to tell a story. Once there was a girl who wanted to be rich, but she didn't have any prospects. This was a rather familiar story, but her voice got softer and softer and slower and slower, and Death was very tired and he fell asleep. And as soon as he was asleep, she seized her lamp and the prince's right next to it. She filled them to the top with oil immortal, and whoosh, down she went. And, the prince didn't even know that she had been gone. And so they lived long, extremely long, impossibly long, and very happy lives. So that's one folk tale. Now I'm going to tack on another one, which is very short, but I love it. And then we'll be done. And by the way, I've had such a good time with you. But now we're going, this is a story about clothes, and I'm very interested in clothes. But if you're Joseph, you're a kid who's never had an overcoat, when your mother comes to you and says, it's time, Joseph, I'm going to make you an overcoat. You're old enough to have an overcoat. What's your favorite color? I mean, she knew it. He said blue. And she got this blue wool. And she measured him. We learned that from our tailor story. And she made a pattern and she cut it out and she sewed it up and it fit him perfectly. And he was so proud. He loved the way he looked in that coat. He loved it so much that he didn't want to take it off. And they couldn't get it off him, actually. And, he changed into his pajamas and he'd put the coat on and go to sleep. And then he wore it at breakfast. And he was kind of a messy eater. And then he wore it to school. And then he wore it on the playground. He wore it everywhere. He wore it constantly. And, life does this to garments, especially around the hem. It was almost as bad as that wedding dress. I mean, it was ragged and it was dirty. And he went back to his mother and he said, I love this coat so much, but look what I have done to it. I've ruined the coat. And she said, well, let me take a little look. And she took out her scissors and cut off that dirty section and hemmed up the rest. And he had a jacket. Oh, that jacket was very handsome. But he wouldn't take it off. I mean, he didn't want to take it off. He wore it morning, noon, and night, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, playing, chores, and the sleeves this time. Oh, you should have seen the sleeves. They were shredded. They were grimy. And he took the coat, the vest, whatever it was. The jacket. We're in the jacket phase. Mom, I've ruined it. It was so handsome and I've ruined it. She said, let me take a little look. Off with the sleeves. And now we get to the vest. And oh, he liked that vest. I mean, he was like his father. His father wore a vest. He felt very important in his vest, but he didn't take it off. And he dribbled on it and it got very, very schmutzig, as they say. And so he took it to her and he said, you made me this lovely vest. I've destroyed this vest. There could be nothing left. She said, let me take a little look. She turned it over and she found on the back, there was a kind of a nice long strip that wasn't too dirty. So she cut it out. She hemmed it up. She said, now you have a scarf. And he put it on. He said, it's like a cravat, like my dad wears. Oh, I'm so proud of my scarf. And he wore it morning, noon, and night. You know how he wore it. And he was getting big and he was eating even more messily. And finally, he brought it back to her and he held it up. And he said, you know, this is worse than any dish rag I've ever seen. There must be nothing salvageable here. She said, let me take a little look. And she found one tiny round space that was still quite blue. And she cut it out and made a little button. And so she sewed that button on his favorite shirt. And the button gave him a lot of pleasure and comfort. He would kind of stroke the button when he was nervous or when he was happy. But he was growing, he was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, he grew out of that shirt. The buttons popped off and they all rolled away, including the blue one. And he said, Mom, it's gone. I have no vestige of that blue coat that you made me, of that vest, of that scarf, of that button. It's all gone. And she said, no, it's not. You know what we have? We have this story. And that's what I want to leave you with. And indeed, we have like 7 minutes. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do with those 7 minutes? Can I just say goodbye? Or do you want me to plug in one more story?
One more
One
story.
more
One more story.
story.
Okay. This is from that same from the same book that I got the overcoat from. It's a guy named Hugh Lupton, a fabulous British storyteller. And here is a girl and her mother, and they are hungry. They're very often poor and hungry. That's the way the stories start. And they hadn't had really anything much to eat. But the mother, she knew a little about, you know, the world out there. She said, you know, there are berries out there. Go out there and pick some berries and bring them back. We'll eat berries. Berries are better than nothing. I mean, actually, berries are pretty good. So the girl went out and started to pluck the berries, and she filled her apron with berries. It was luckily berry season. And she was getting ready to go back to her mother when all of a sudden an old woman appeared in front of her. And the old woman said, oh, you got a lot of berries there. And she said, yes, I did. I'm looking forward to eating them. And the old woman said, it's been a long time since I've eaten a berry. Would you like to share a few of your berries with me? And the girl, she had a generous heart. She said, of course, take as many as you want. And the old woman plucked a berry with her gnarled fingers. And she had kind of whiskery lips and very few teeth. And she popped that berry in and she kind of gummed it. And she swallowed it down and she said to that girl, you know, you are good. You are a good girl. And I have something to give you. I have you a present for you. And from under her apron, she gave her a pot, a little pot. And the girl said, well, that's really lovely, but we don't have anything to cook in it. I mean, I don't think we're going to cook up these berries. Oh, said the old woman, it's a magic pot. You just say, cook, pot, cook. Look what happens. I say it, and all of a sudden in that pot, porridge started to form. Yum, yum. And then when you want it, when you're finished, you say, stop, pot, stop. And all of a sudden the porridge is gone and the pot is clean. Pretty nifty. She went home with the berries. She went home with a pot. She showed her mother, cook, pot, cook. Oh, the porridge mixed with the berries, so delicious. And so they had a lot to eat. That pot was faithful. It kept putting forth the porridge. And then the mother said, you know, the berry season is almost over. Go back and get some more berries. And the girl, of course, good girl, she went off to the forest. Now, while she was gone, the mother said, I've seen what she does to get it going. I want to see if it'll work for me or if it only works for her. She said, cook, pot, cook. The porridge started to form, and she had a few bites. And then she didn't know what to do because the pot started making more porridge, and it started to overflow and make a mess on the floor. And it flowed out of the front door down the street of the village. And it was making an almighty mess. And the people were very shocked. And the girl came back and she said, what have you done? Well, I just wanted a little porridge. And she called out, stop, pot, stop. And all the porridge was gone. Well, you know, now that the townspeople knew, they used that pot to feed everyone. And the most important thing about this story is you could say boundaries. You need to know when to start it And most important, you need to know when to stop it. And that is my last story.
It's just wonderful. Very rich program. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So do you want to stop your recording or
Yes.
keep?
Oh, tell me what to do. I go stop.